It is invariably stated by those with any sort of power that we live in a democracy, and if anyone is in any way dissatisfied with their exercise of that power, she has her solution in the ballot box. The sole purpose of these lectures is to prove definitively, once and for all, that on the contrary, we don't live in a democracy but in a fascist behaviourist state that owes nothing whatever to democracy and the rule of law. In fact, as I show below, the exact opposite of democracy. You either have democracy or you don't. There's no tertium quid. On a cold winter's evening in January 1971, it came to me that the error in the argument lies, an apposite word, in the definition of democracy as majority rule. Majority rule is ex hypothesi the worst form of dictatorship with the greatest number of dictators, the exact opposite of democracy. My beloved mother pointed out that those who have power are animals, which I have come to realise is grossly unfair to animals, most of which are good to their own kind at least. Hitler was apparently kind to animals. The only thing that distinguishes humans from animals is democracy. Democracy is all around us. If you're sitting in a waiting room somewhere, or perhaps on a bus, and it becomes stuffy, you don't simply get up and open the window, because that would be dictatorship and is likely to lead to fights, as I was on the receiving end of once. You say something to the effect of, "Shall I open the window?" I had rarely got a response of anything other than, "Oh yes please," and it has never got as far as a vote. The sociopathic lot that they are, in the days before the wholly democratic ban on smoking, smokers would close windows without a word to anyone because they felt cold, forcing everybody else to put up with their stink. Leaving aside the questions of cost to the public health and damage to the environment as a whole, such as require the compulsory wearing of seat belts in cars and crash helmets on motorbikes, which requirements again are wholly democratic. Smoking is perfectly democratic in private among consenting adults. You have the paradox nowadays where if you want to go into a cafe or restaurant on a hot day, the outdoor tables are all taken up with smokers. So paradoxically, they are the ones getting the benefit of the fresh air, while the non-smokers have to put up with the stuffy indoors. The only democratic solution is for smoking to be in private. In the days before the ban, before its annual conference, the Labour Party would make a great show of having a vote to determine whether to allow smoking at the conference. If in the affirmative, this meant that any non-smokers were forced to breathe the smoke of others, which is wholly undemocratic. The atmosphere is a resource common to all, the common wealth, especially in the confined space of a conference hall. This vote was an attempt to show that the Labour Party is a democratic socialist party, not like those nasty communists who seek to impose their will by force. Democracy is not fascism divided up into 5 yearly chunks, Democratic socialism is as much a contradiction in terms as is Christian socialism. Christianity is all about giving, socialism is all about taking. No attempt has ever been made to excuse capitalism as democratic. Capitalism and socialism are exactly like smoking. Perfectly democratic if practiced in private among consenting adults. In the COVID or any other epidemic, going to a public house or a public dance or a football match is not a social act, but an antisocial act. Those conservative backbench MPs who claim to be libertarian want freedom for themselves to sit at home raking in their capitalist profits, while everybody else is free to go out to work and catch COVID. In his book Utopia, without the reading of which no pupil should leave school, my mentor Thomas More said that politics is for old men, wise and well experienced. I'm starting to think that I'm just old enough and wise enough to start taking it up. I've certainly had enough experience. It's not for careerist politicians on the make for themselves and their supporters, who've never done an honest day's work in their lives. If you keep in mind the image of the village elders of either sex and any race or sexual orientation, etc., meeting under the banyan tree to discuss matters of concern to the tribe as a whole, you can't go wrong about democracy. They discuss matters till they come to a conclusion. Only if they can't come to a conclusion is it necessary to vote. But it is vital to note that voting is not democracy in action, but the failure of democracy. Committees exist to discuss and agree on any matter, and the chairman will say that she feels that the sense of the meeting is in favour or against. Only if there is a call for a vote is it necessary to have one. In Nigeria, for example, local matters are determined by a local, certificated king who presides over the village elders. People appearing before them refer to them as fathers. Sometimes it may be necessary to discuss matters of concern to other tribes as well. It may not be practicable for all the elders to meet together, so representatives have to be chosen. Again, in a democracy, these are chosen by agreement, and only if agreement is not possible does voting become necessary. Again, voting is the failure of democracy. As a corollary, if there is only one candidate for a particular post, then there is no vote. There's nothing to vote about. Even if that particular candidate has a majority of votes against him, so long as he was properly proposed and seconded, he is still appointed to the post. Any vote is in the form of a vote of confidence. It has to be properly proposed and seconded. Democracy has nothing whatever to do with how politicians are elected or otherwise come to power. It is solely to do with what they do when they get there. The communist system, where only one candidate appears on the ballot paper, is actually nearer to majority rule, because unlike so-called democratic elections, she is required to get at least 50% of the available votes. It is said that 90% of the population of the UK don't want a multicultural society. It is only democracy, not majority rule, that is going to prevent the imposition of Sharia law if a certain minority achieve their aim of becoming the majority. Like the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, in that circumstance we might be delighted to have a multicultural society. Many years ago I was waiting at a bus stop on the Old Kent Road. It was just before an election and somebody had put a sticker on the shelter with about 10 X's on it and the annotation, "Here is your lifetime supply of democracy." How I wish I could meet that person. Jury trials require or required unanimity in their verdicts. The Anglo-Saxons who invented it were much nearer to democracy than we are today. Britain is the last colonial state of the British Empire and is governed not by democracy, by a series of self-perpetuating cliques of psychotic liars and cheats that have existed since at least the time of Henry VIII, and over which the public has no control whatever, not the least of which are the political parties themselves. Voting in elections may succeed in changing housing policy a bit, education policy a bit, healthcare policy a bit, but in terms of the actual government of the country, such as who appoints the judiciary, ambassadors, etc., the political leaders are presented with a choice of two candidates who differ only in name and face. As Anthony Wedgwood Benn rightly put it, all a minister of the Crown has to do to negate democracy completely is simply to transfer files from his in-tray to his out-tray. Both Hitler and Stalin came to power by majority rule. The opposite of dictatorship is not anarchy, mob rule. I was taught at school that the best form of government is a benign despot. According to Mark Antony, Caesar was a benign despot, protecting the people of Rome against the Senate. Whereas I can name quite a few despots, not many of them are benign, or if they are to start with, remain so for long. As Mark Antony said, ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Military juntas come and stay. The barons at Runnymede were not, as particularly Americans seem to think, the vanguard of democracy, but like the senators of Rome, just such a military junta, wanting power for themselves rather than the king. Even though the Labour Party in supporting majority rule is undemocratic, this does not mean that it can't do democratic things. The ban on smoking in public and fox hunting are prime examples. Country folk think they are a law unto themselves. Towns and townies are put there merely for their convenience. As Ratty says to Mole in The Wind in the Willows, beyond the wild woods comes the wide world, and that's something that doesn't matter either to you or to me. I've never been there and I'm never going there, nor you either if you've got any sense at all. Don't ever refer to it again, please. They regard governments and members of parliament as put there to work for their particular benefit. Under Conservative governments at least, the National Farmers Union regards the Ministry of Agriculture, by whatever name, as put there for the benefit of farmers and all landowners, which distinction I deal with below, instead of to control farmers and see they don't conspire together against the consumer, either in terms of quality, quantity or cost. It has recently been stated that in the world for the first time More people live in towns than in the countryside. So by majority rule it should be said that the countryside and its occupants are put there for their convenience in terms of food production and recreation. On the advice of his hangers-on, Henry VIII claimed that he was appointed by God. Thus his every whim was necessarily the will of God. Governments elected by majority rule claim that they are appointed by the people. Thus everything they do is the will of the people. By that argument it follows that anybody who opposes the king is supporting Satan, and anybody who does not kowtow to governments is opposing democracy. Military leaders refer to the national will. In the trial of a civil servant accused of disclosing government corruption contrary to the public interest, the judge felt obliged to direct the jury that the public interest meant the interests of the government of the day, which is to cover up its own corruption contrary to the public interest. A parliament is not supposed to be a microcosm of the population as a whole. A noble, worthy and vital trade though it is, the fact that there are 2% of dustmen in the population as a whole does not mean that 12 MPs should be dustmen to speak for them, as it were. Until democracy is established, the most democratic thing to do is to refuse to vote, refuse to go to the polling stations, even where, as in Australia, it is a criminal offence not to do so. That says as much about democracy or the lack of it in Australia. The fundamental democratic right is to refuse to vote, just as is the right, like Dr. Crippen, to run away from the police without being told it's an admission of guilt. These are the two fundamental democratic rights. The relationship between law and politics can be expressed mathematically as that politics is the first differential coefficient of law with respect to time. Law is thus the integral of politics from the dawn of history up to the present. dl by dt equals p, and integral p dt equals L. The law is real enough, but justice is an illusion. Instead of accepting that injustices will occur whether by design or otherwise, and extending confidence in the system by exposing it to the full, the aim is always to cover it up, thereby compounding incompetence with dishonesty. In a democracy, you do not live under the government, but under the common law. For example, the law of trespass existed in the days of horses and carts, but it took no intervention of governments or politicians whatever for it to be applied to aircraft. Indeed, it's only by the intervention of the legislature that they are allowed to fly at all, save of course for military aircraft. The law is not the means whereby the government controls the public, but the means whereby the public, through its parliament or otherwise, controls its government. The law is what governs the government. Neither governments nor parliaments have the power to make law, only to change it. Thus in a democracy the government lies under the people, and thus should be called the servament. It was established at the trial of Charles I, who claimed he could not be tried because he was above the law and subject only to God. He is subject to the law because it is the law that makes him king. Whether there is anybody who can lawfully try the king is another matter. Then the International Criminal Tribunal in The Hague recently had not the slightest difficulty in trying Slobodan Milosevic, a former head of state, for crimes against humanity. Saddam Hussein was tried by a purely domestic court in Iraq. Charles I had been deposed by force, just as had the Saxon King Harold. In a democracy, the head of state is as much subject to domestic judicial process as anybody else. This thus overcomes the objection, as Louis XIV would put it, that l'état c'est moi. The government that forges its own currency, or anybody else's for that matter, under the pretext of quantitative easing, is as much guilty of forgery as is anybody else. The government that recklessly ignores scientific advice to impose restrictions during the COVID crisis is as much guilty of manslaughter, culpable homicide, or worse, as is the driver of a car who fails to stop at a traffic light, thereby killing a pedestrian crossing the road. A problem that has plagued me since it was first posited by my wonderful headmaster Rupert Jackson is quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Who controls the controller? It can be seen that the answer is not who but what. Just as the law controls the state, it controls the government of that state. The trouble is that the judiciary are reluctant to interfere in anything that might be considered political, leaving a power vacuum into which the government leaps with all its joy. The fact that the government can ignore all scientific advice on measures to protect the public by controlling COVID, by letting rip out of control, thereby costing countless lives and deaths, when they and the MPs who support them should be convicted, if not of mass murder, then at least of mass manslaughter. Democracy is the law. The law is democracy. The law is freedom. Freedom is the law. Freedom is democracy. Democracy is freedom. People have to take responsibility for their own governments. It's not foreign governments that are your enemy, it's your own government. As the people of Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had to find out the hard way. In democracy, the word foreign would eventually cease to have a meaning, just as it did in the Stone Age. For more on which, please see my book Democracy, Theory and Practice, published by the World Law Centre. Majority rule is leading to a conflict between the generations, which last surfaced exactly half a century ago with the Angry Brigade. This was put down by the judge in the cases, directing the jury that it was not a political trial because we live in a democracy, and if anybody has a problem with that, they have their solution in the ballot box. This deprived them of their whole defence and was thus a gross misdirection, and thus they are entitled to be acquitted and compensated as far as possible for their destroyed lives. Families are, or at least should be, feudal in nature. Most of the problems of the world are caused by parents treating their children as equals, such as asking them what they want to eat. What child isn't going to pick a hamburger, chips and soda for every meal? As they grow up, children naturally espouse socialism, as indeed did I. They then grow up into discrete beings with self-respect and thus respect for others, which is what democracy means. Exactly the same applies to nation states. We should rejoice, for example, in the French, Russian, Chinese revolutions as being a necessary step in the path from dictatorship to democracy, and regret that our own revolution failed. The biggest disasters in British history were the battles of Trafalgar and Waterloo, which would at least have got rid of the self-styled aristocracy. The term local democracy is sometimes heard, meaning local majority rule. This results, for example, in where you're driving along a main road in the country, you suddenly come across a 20-mile-an-hour limit put there by some local council, regardless of the rights of the public as a whole. People are allowed to use the public highway outside their houses as private garages, and the public pavement outside their shops and cafes as extensions of those businesses, purely because they have votes in for the local politicians, and those who simply want to exercise their public right to pass along it do not. The King's Highway is not a stable yard. A similar system existed in medieval Europe, where the River Rhine was a major artery for trade. Every little princeling along its banks erected a boom across the river and demanded a toll. This meant that the poor people of Switzerland, who had to rely on the river as their only means of export, were forced to become experts in the manufacture of small high-value goods such as clocks and watches, to make their exports economic. Local democracy means that where any three people come together, any two can impose their will on the third. It is thus the worst possible form of dictatorship, and is espoused by the so-called Liberal Democratic Party, which is thus a contradiction on all terms. Democracy has nothing whatever to do with the rights of majorities, nor even the rights of minorities, save for that supreme minority, the individual. Bentham's assertion that democracy means the greatest good of the greatest number is thus not, as it is always portrayed, the profound thought of a genius, but the reductio ad absurdum of the argument that majority rule is democracy. Democracy means the common good of all, and is nothing other than the apotheosis of good manners and respect for others.